Good evening. I am Christiana Liniatis, Director of Preservation Services for Preservation Buffalo Niagara. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our Revolutionary Males program here with Dr. Jeff Giovanoni. For tonight's webinar, we are going to learn amazing facts about two early activists, gay activists here in the city of Buffalo, the sites and spaces they worked in and for, and how their influence affected the gay rights movement in Buffalo in general, and certainly the state as well. So tonight, I hope that we're going to learn a lot of really new information that has not been presented previously through Dr. Jeff's blog series. So a lot of new information. I hope you guys have some questions or comments. As usual in the Zoom world, we have that chat box that's available for comments and any sort of discussion that you wish to have, but we also have that Q&A box, and that's where we definitely want you to make sure to put your questions so that I can see them and make sure that Dr. Jeff can answer them at the end when we have a Q&A section. With that, if Jeff, you can go to the next slide. Okay. Oh, so there we are, Revolutionary Males. Here is our program for tonight. Next slide. For those of you who are new to Preservation Buffalo Niagara, we are your local preservation advocacy organization. Our mission is to identify, protect, and promote our unique architecture, historic legacy, and to connect people to the places they love here in Western New York. And that's important, Western New York, just because our name has Buffalo and Niagara in it. Actually, while our name has Buffalo and Niagara in it, we actually provide services to the 5 westernmost counties of New York State. So our service area is quite large in trying to accomplish this quite broad mission. Next. And in trying to accomplish that great big mission that we have in our wide service area, we like to divide our work up into 4 main categories: education, technical service, advocacy, and community development. Tonight is a perfect example of that educational programming and services that we provide to give you all the information you need to better understand your historic built environment, so then you can then take those steps to protect and preserve our historic built environment. Technical service, we at Preservation Buffalo Niagara are here to answer any questions you may have, whether they are materiality type questions, how to fix something, how to properly restore or treat a material or resource, or those preservation planning questions. How do you landmark buildings and resources? How do you get things listed to the National Register? How do you get historic tax credits if you're eligible? And then last, we have advocacy and community development. Essentially, those are the same exact thing, but with advocacy, it's where we are taking that lead to advocate for the preservation of a resource, to advocate against the demolition of something, or to advocate for legislation that will advance historic preservation. And then community development is where we come into your community and give you the tools and information you need to be in charge of your preservation destiny. And with that, on the next slide, I'm actually going to introduce Dr. Jeff Giovanoni and invite him to turn his camera on and have him speak to our Gay Places initiative. Actually, I think that'll be more appropriate.
Okay, well, I want to start by thanking PBN by having me back and supporting this initiative, which the talk tonight is part of. And the Gay Places Initiative is 1 year old. We started in June of 2020, and our mission with this initiative is as follows. We want to document, preserve, and celebrate our LGBTQ historic sites in Western New York. We also want to provide education about these sites and the people and events connected to them through academically defensible public history. So we very much see ourselves as a scholarly initiative that we have that scholarly focus, but we also want to make the history available to the community and to the public, and to move from a bi-coastal narrative to a holistic narrative of LGBTQ history using Western New York as a model. And what I mean by that is so much of LGBTQ history, including LGBTQ preservation work, focuses on large cities on the East and West Coast. So New York, San Francisco, LA, and we want to move towards a more comprehensive narrative by integrating LGBTQ history in Western New York and the historic sites connected with the community into that broader narrative of LGBTQ history. And in particular here, we are inspired by something that the late great activist and writer Madeline Davis would often say about LGBTQ history in Western New York, that our history, or excuse me, our community has a past, but no history. In other words, important things happen, we existed, but we haven't incorporated that information into the broader narrative of LGBTQ history, or right, who we are as a nation, as a country. And it's important to also point out here that there are currently no sites in Western New York that are on the National Register of Historic Places specifically for their connection to LGBTQ history, although we are working to change that. Some of the sites that we've identified are in historic districts, for example, Allentown and the West Village, but there's not a specific site that is on that National Register because of its connection to the LGBTQ community and LGBTQ history. Okay, so with that said, let's jump into revolutionary males. And I'm gonna go, I was gonna try to go back, but we'll just go forward. So this is part of what I've been researching and working on over the past year. And I originally started looking at the two activists we're going to talk about tonight, Charlie Haynie and Jim Zeiss, separately. And then I started realizing that their stories were actually interconnected in some interesting ways, and that even though they only knew each other in passing, as far as I've been able to find out, that looking at one in the context of the other helps to highlight their accomplishments and also give us a better understanding of the gay liberation movement in Buffalo. In particular, the relationship between SUNY at Buffalo and the university and the broader community. And I have to, history is really a community effort, and I have to thank a lot of people here, not individually, because I'm going to inevitably forget someone, and I don't want anyone to be left out. But there were so many people, both in Buffalo and also in Washington, D.C., that talked to me either about Charlie or Jim, or pointed me towards resources, or gave me digital access to archival materials when things were closed. So a lot of people assisted me in being able to talk about these two activists. And there's 5 major points of similarity between them. And then I'm going to talk about each of them individually, and we're going to connect their stories to place. And to different sites in Buffalo. So they were both involved in various leftist social movements beginning in the 1960s. In their work, they saw education and social change as interconnected. They redefined conventional masculinity in theory and practice. So connected to the way that each of them went about social change and their involvement in the gay liberation movement and beyond, that involved for them redefining at the time what it meant to be a man, essentially. They demonstrate the relationship between the university, SUNY at Buffalo, and the broader community in Western New York, and how this relationship affected the gay liberation movement in Buffalo and beyond. And I would argue that they are both significant but unsung or underrepresented figures within the history of the gay liberation movement. So not just in Buffalo, but I mean as a whole here. Okay, so let's start with Charlie Haynie, or Charles Atkinson Haynie. It's pictured on the right here along with Paul Richmond, who is another faculty member in Tolstoy College at SUNY at Buffalo that Charlie was the director of from 1969 to 1985. So he was born in Queens in 1935 and attends Cornell University. He enters in the fall of 1962 and he's studying engineering physics. He graduates with his degree in engineering physics in 1956. And I think maybe I got a date wrong there. He enters in 52, graduates in 56, and then he enters the PhD program in mathematics at Cornell. And it's the late 1950s, early 1960s that he has his political awakening. And one of the first things that he does, or an event that happens, is there is a major fraternity at Cornell that is racially exclusionary. In other words, they will not allow Black students to pledge for the fraternity. And so Charlie and a couple of his friends, one of whom was Black, organized a picket of the fraternity house to draw attention to their racist practices. And as you can imagine, the fraternity was incredibly unhappy that their behavior was being called attention to in this way, to the extent that members of the fraternity actually physically assaulted some of the people that were picketing, spit on them, urinated on them. But this is really Haynie's political awakening. He ends up dropping out of his PhD program and getting involved in the civil rights movement in the Deep South. And when he's involved in the movement, in the South, he also doesn't abandon his training in mathematics. He actually develops programs where he was teaching calculus to Black youth in the South, also gets involved with the anti-war movement. And in the late 1960s, is tapped to direct an experimental education program at SUNY at Buffalo. And so in the late 1960s, this is when the modern SUNY system as we know it is being created. And so the campus, which was the university at Buffalo, is rapidly changing and developing into SUNY at Buffalo. And the governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, taps Martin Meyerson, who was the acting dean at UC Berkeley, to come and be the president of SUNY at Buffalo, right, under this new SUNY system. And so Meyerson was originally from New York City. His academic training was in urban planning from Columbia. And in terms of his administrative work at Berkeley, he was particularly well known for the way that he handled and dealt with students during the Berkeley free speech movement, which is a prolonged series of protests that students engaged in from 1964 to 1965, railing against policies that the university tried to institute that curtailed their First Amendment Right. And so kind of Meyerson is brought to SUNY at Buffalo because of that relationship that he, in part because of that relationship he had with students to transform SUNY at Buffalo into a premier educational institution, and to also make that education meaningful to students in terms of what they were interested in terms of, right, their social interests at the time, right? A lot of students being involved in the anti-war movement, right, civil rights movement, other causes. And Meyerson, well, he was president of SUNY at Buffalo from 66 to 69, actually lived in the Darwin Martin House in Parkside, which is designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. So just an interesting fact there that I came across in my research about where he lived. And one of the things that Meyerson creates is an interdisciplinary series of programs that was called the colleges, or the UB collegiate system. And I have to admit that when I first, encountered this concept of the colleges, it was difficult to wrap my head around at first because it's so different from what higher education looks like at this moment. But ideally, Meyerson's idea, and he was drawing from other universities like Oxford and Cambridge, was that the university was rapidly expanding, and it would be easy for students to get alienated within this vast institution. So he proposed the creation of these small thematic learning communities that were called colleges, that were both student and faculty led. They were not departments. And so here's a document from the University at Buffalo archives from Charles Planck, or Chip Planck, who is actually the founder of Tolstoy College, which I'll talk more about in just a minute. He's the person that recruits Charlie Haynie to come to SUNY at Buffalo. So he's saying in this document, there are these small autonomous units where there's freedom. There are places where students and faculty can take refuge from the university, but also in part where they prepare to carry out a critique of the university. Places which, because they are in tension with the university, do not aim at the precise definition and finality of a department or rate of field or a traditional discipline. And they're concerned primarily with the perspective of the liberal educator, presenting the historical, moral, and personal dimensions of any problem or subject. The colleges should be, therefore, small educational and social communities in varying degrees of instructive separation from the ongoing society of the university, right? So again, these small autonomous, multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary thematic units. And the college that Planck founds is, is this my right slide? Tolstoy College, but he actually originally wanted to call it Paul Goodman College. And Paul Goodman was a bisexual poet, cultural critic, and he wrote a book, it was published in 1960, called Growing Up Absurd, that was very popular with the new left, or this new generation of student activists who were involved with, for example, organizations like Students for a Democratic Society. And one of the things that Paul Goodman talks about in Growing Up Absurd is the fact that he saw so many youth in America at the time experiencing issues or not living up to their full potential because he saw the education that they were receiving was out of touch with the social world that they were actually living in, right? So advocating for meaningful education that actually allows students to understand and change and better society. But Chip Plank was told by Martin Meyerson that he couldn't call the college Paul Goodman College because Paul Goodman was still alive, and it would be better to name it after, right, someone who was dead. Essentially, it would be less controversial. And so then Planck chooses the Russian writer Leo Tolstoy, right, also because of his focus on education and social change. And you know, there is a variety of other colleges, again, structured around different thematic topics. So there was, you know, College A that looked at anarchism, and an environmental college, Rachel Carson College, Women's Studies College, founded by Liz Kennedy, right? So a variety of these different thematic units. And here's a photo of, so we see Charlie Haynie in the center, and then Chip Plank is on the left with other students from Tolstoy College in the 1970s. And one of the things that Charlie Haynie is also involved in after he gets recruited to be the director of Tolstoy College, and Chip Plank learns about him because there were other young faculty members at SUNY at Buffalo, right? So the university is expanding, and there's this whole, you know, cohort of young, talented faculty members who are entering the university. And there were other faculty members who had done their graduate work at Cornell and suggested Charlie Haynie as a director of Tolstoy College because of how well he was known in student activism from his time at Cornell. And Haynie was a member of a group that was called the Hayes Hall 45. So a group of 45 faculty members who essentially staged a sit-in in the president's office in 1969 because they were concerned about the student unrest that was happening on campus due to the anti-war movement and the university's, right, increasingly militarized response in terms of inviting police onto the campus, right? And we can also see, you know, in this photograph, there's actually a student takeover of Hayes Hall in 1965. And I should point out here that when this group of faculty members stages the sit-in and they end up being arrested, Meyerson had essentially stepped down as president at this point, and there was an interim president named Peter Regan. So he's the president that they're sitting in on. So Haynie participates in that. And with Tolstoy College, the college was also associated with the student organization, the Gay Liberation Front, at the University at Buffalo. And Tolstoy really starts out not having a specific focus on gay liberation. They're more so looking at anarchy. And when I say that, the way that Charlie Haynie and Chip Plank defined anarchy was small intentional communities or small groups of people who are coming together and forming a community or a structure outside of a larger social structure to actually, right, challenge those larger structures of society and to create change. So kind of that's how they were defining what they were doing. But as the college progresses, there is an increased focus and realization that in order to do that kind of work, they also need to look at gender roles and sexuality, and to critique what masculinity is, and to look at a variety of different forms of activism and social change movements, including gay liberation. And so the Gay Liberation Front, the student group, is founded at UB in the spring of 1970 by a student named Rick Landman. And initially, the GLF at UB met at the Norton Union on the South Campus, or the original Main Street campus. The building that was the Norton Union is now called Harriman Hall, but it was essentially a building that existed to house student activities. So this is where Gay Liberation Front originally met. And if I'm not mistaken, this is a bit difficult to piece together. But then when the new campus was built in Amherst, right now called the North Campus, the name Norton Hall was given to another building on that campus, but since it's become Squire Hall. So lots of interesting swapping of names of buildings as the Amherst campus is being built and SUNY at Buffalo is expanding. And here's some advertisements from events from the Gay Liberation Front that appeared in the SUNY at Buffalo student newspaper, The Spectrum. As we could see, they're doing an event called Gay People in Revolt, 242 Norton Hall. They also did a Halloween event in the Norton Union as well. So this is the original meeting place of the organization. As the group progresses throughout the 1970s, they end up meeting in some of the same spaces that are also occupied by Tolstoy College, which was also called College F, because essentially what they did in terms of when the colleges were founded, they gave them kind of lettered numbers in terms of the order that they were founded in. And as I mentioned, as the program progresses, there's an increased focus on gay liberation. And I thought this was quite an interesting quote from an article that appeared in the Buffalo Courier Express in 1974 that talked in part about Tolstoy College. It was called Experimental Topics, Challenge Traditions. And the article says, College F, Tolstoy College, might be summed up as the school which majors in anarchy and gay liberation. So sign me up. And then this is an image of a course catalog of the colleges from 1970 to 1971. So in terms of physical space on the campus that Tolstoy occupied, and this was also the case with many of the other colleges, the university is rapidly expanding, and there's not room for all of the colleges on or within the physical buildings that exist on the campus. And so originally, a lot of the colleges are meeting in storefronts on Main Street that are rented by the university. Eventually, they move into a series of trailers on the Main Street campus, and series of numbered trailers. Tolstoy was in trailer number 6, and then people have told me it was a pink trailer that Tolstoy College was in. And then Christy and I need to investigate this further, some of the colleges then moved into houses on Winspear Avenue that the university purchased because they needed more space. So there was an address associated with Tolstoy College, 264 Winspear Avenue, but we're not sure if that was an actual house or if that was the address that was assigned to the location of the trailer. And if it was an actual house, it's no longer extant. Or it no longer exists. And then eventually Tolstoy was allowed to have some classes in Townsend Hall on the South Campus, which is pictured here. And so if you're on the campus, think back to the picture I showed of Hayes Hall. You're standing in front of Hayes Hall. Townsend Hall is directly to the right. And also at this time, right, the North Campus is being constructed. And originally, one of the ideas for the colleges is that they would be housed in a building on the North Campus that was called the Ellicott Complex, which is essentially student housing. It was constructed in 1974, designed by David Brody and Associates. It's in a brutalist architectural style. So the idea is, right, if you look at the buildings, there's all of these different kind of like L-shaped units, and that the different units could potentially, right, house the different colleges. That doesn't exactly come to pass. Tolstoy never actually holds any classes in the Ellicott complex, though I believe somewhere near the complex, they did give them some land for students who wanted to do like farming and communal gardening. And one of the things that we see with the Amherst campus and why the choice was to build the campus in Amherst as opposed to downtown Buffalo is many students and also faculty felt that there was this fear if the campus was too close to downtown, it would be too easy for the campus to become a site of social protest or unrest. So instead, we get this kind of more isolated, less inspiring new campus. And in fact, one student at the time described the new campus as he felt like on this campus that he was like a rat in a maze. Because the buildings were all so similar. They're all in this brutalist style that it was kind of an isolated and architecturally uninspiring campus. And one of the other things that I think is important to point out is the fact that the campus was constructed in Amherst actually had a negative impact on the Black community in Buffalo. And as we know, one of the longstanding issues facing the Black community was a lack of jobs and economic opportunities. There's actually a race riot in 1967, starts on the west side, then moves to the east side. And essentially, the impetus for the riot was a lack of economic opportunity for Black Buffalonians. There's a sociologist at SUNY at Buffalo, Frank Bessig, who wrote a book that was called The Anatomy of a Riot, Buffalo 1967, where he went out and interviewed members of the community, particularly Black youth who had participated in the riot. He wanted to understand what their motivations were and what they hoped to accomplish. And this individual that he's interviewing, when he asked, do you feel that people are justified in rioting? The answer is, in a way, because most of the white people got all these businesses in Negro communities that they charge more for these goods than you would get downtown. Like the drugstores, they charge high prices for the drugs and stuff. White people, I figure that if they want us to patronize their businesses, then they should hire some of us, which they don't. And then he later asked, do you think this rioting will accomplish anything? And the answer is, it will get the whitey to move faster because he don't want his businesses torn up. And so we can also see here, right there is the issue of lack of transportation. That the members of the Black community were forced to pay these higher prices at white-owned businesses on the east side because the downtown area was less accessible through public transportation. So this connects to the university because one of the downsides of constructing that Amherst campus is that it wasn't, so it could have been a source of employment for Black Buffalonians, but it was not easily accessible through public transportation and required people, right, to essentially, have their own cars to be able to get there, which requires a certain amount of economic privilege. So I thought it was important to point that out about the construction of the campus as well. Okay, so let's move on from Charlie Haynie and Tolstoy to Jim Zeiss. Now, Jim Zeiss is originally from Wisconsin, and he comes to SUNY at Buffalo as a part of that influx of young, talented faculty members in the late 1960s, early 1970s, as the university is expanding. And he is a professor in the political science department and is completing his PhD in political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and doesn't become involved in the collegiate system at UB, even though certainly many of his interests would overlap with some of the colleges, but instead becomes involved in the gay liberation movement in Buffalo. Jim is on the right in the photograph here. And this was a gay rights march on Albany from 1971 that he helped to organize, that I will talk more about in just a minute. And we have very little exists of Jim's own words about his life and his experience. But this is something that he said about his reasons for joining the gay liberation movement in Buffalo that was published in the Fifth Freedom, which is Buffalo's gay community newspaper. The strain and nourishment of the post-Stonewall period were enormous for those of us who argued, pushed, debated, marched, lobbied, sang, and cried our way through it. Those were costly days, but also indelibly instructive ones. We came out of that period far less naive about the depth of homophobia in American society. My own involvement began in Buffalo in late 1970, and the impact on me was enormous. I first sought out the Mattachine Society, Buffalo's first gay and lesbian civil rights organization, not because I was outraged by anything anti-gay that I saw. I have since learned that we seldom storm out of the closet, nor did I particularly believe that gay rights had to be furthered in Buffalo. I came because I was a lonely teenager in his 20s, anxious to know where the action was, but unaware of gay activism. So that's how he starts out and ends up getting very much caught up in the movement, and that ends up being a lifelong passion for him. So he gets involved with the Mattachine Society of the Niagara Frontier and becomes the organization's political chair. And one of the things that he does as political chair, in addition to lobbying the state legislature for the passage of gay rights legislation is to organize or help to organize the first march for gay rights on a state capitol, which occurred in 1971. And at the time, the Madison Society of the Niagara Frontier was meeting at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Buffalo, located at 695 Elmwood Avenue. And their previous location, which is a building that no longer exists at 70 Delaware Avenue, just off of Niagara Square. It was right at the site of the current Frank A. Sedita court building, was targeted by the police. The owner ends up fleeing Buffalo, so they don't have a place for the organization to meet that is safe, essentially. And the minister of UUCB at the time, Reverend Dr. Paul Carnes, allows Mattachine to meet at UUCB. And Paul Carnes himself was involved in a variety of different social causes, also civil rights movement, anti-war movement, was a national Unitarian leader. And because he has these sympathies to different social movements, he allows this fledgling gay rights organization to meet at UUCB. And in terms of organizing this march on Albany, UUCB is kind of the rallying point that people in Buffalo going to the march leave from. So Mattachine organized cars, buses to take people to the rally. And we see from this article from the Buffalo Evening News, it was a variety of gay organizations from around the state. More than 3,000 people marched. A spokesman from Buffalo said that he and about 60 other persons came from the Niagara Frontier area for the rally. And so the goal of the march was to get the state legislature to support pro-gay legislation in the areas of employment, housing, welfare, and police entrapment. And it was a two-day event. So March 13th of 1971, there were speakers and a dance with a live rock band. And then on the 14th, there was a mile-long march, which is pictured in the photograph here, that ended with a rally on the steps of the state capitol, right? And as I mentioned, Jim Zeiss, as Mattachine's political chair, was one of the organizers of the march. And maybe you've seen this photograph before. It was taken by the lesbian photographer Diana Davies from New York City. That's become kind of quite popular, and her photographs have circulated a lot, especially during Pride Month. And so let me talk a little bit about the context of what's going on in this particular photograph. We see, going from left to right, Jim Owls, who is the president of the Gay Activist Alliance from New York City. Ernie Raig, who was a gay activist from Albany. Madeline Davis from Buffalo. Jim Zeiss, of course, and then Michael Hamilton, who's another gay activist from Buffalo, who is involved with both Gay Liberation Front at SUNY at Buffalo and also Mattachine. Now, Madeline wanted to be a marshal for the march, and her girlfriend at the time didn't want her to do it because she thought it would be dangerous. So she said, okay, I won't do it. And then Jim Zeiss was walking up and down this line of people looking for a speaker, and they wanted to have, when they're speaking on the steps of the Capitol, equal representation from different areas of the state, and they needed a woman from upstate New York. So he's walking up and down the line and saying, I need a woman from upstate, I need a woman from upstate, and sees Madeline and says, Madeline, you're gonna do it. And so that's how she ends up at the head of this line. And she speaks, extemporaneously from the steps of the Capitol. She didn't have a prepared speech. She just speaks off the top of her head. But for those of you that, know Madeline, if you gave her a stage, she could turn it on and she could perform. And the speech that she gives Jim Zeiss a different idea, that Mattachine should run her as a delegate to the 1972 Democratic National Convention, as a delegate for George McGovern. He's the Democratic nominee running against Richard Nixon. And so getting Madeline elected is the brainchild of Jim Zeiss, and he is her campaign manager. And I think this is where, right, the issue of defining masculinity in a different way comes in terms of the partnership that Jim had with Madeline, that, right, he very much was politically knowledgeable. He could have spoken on the steps of the Capitol. He could have run as a delegate for the DNC, but he was more so the person who was the organizer behind the scenes, and recognized that she was a better spokesperson, that she should be the face of the gay community in Buffalo, right? And had no issue with a woman doing that, right? And often, we think that at this time, in terms of the gay liberation movement in the 70s, a lot of gay men were sexist. They didn't want to work with lesbians. But as we see with both Jim and Charlie, that was not universally the case. And I believe Christy's going to put a link to Madeline's DNC speech if you want to listen to that at some point in the chat. And one of the things that's cut off in the speech, however, is in terms of the coverage. Walter Cronkite actually introduces Madeline to the television audience, but he kind of comes in after she's already started speaking, and she starts her speech at the DNC by saying, my name is Madeline Davis. I'm an elected delegate from the 37th Congressional District in Buffalo, New York. I am a lesbian. And I believe Christy's also going to put in the chat a link to a piece I wrote about Madeline for Belt magazine that's commemorating her life and her legacy. And then one of the other things that comes out of that march in Albany is Madeline is inspired to write her iconic gay liberation song, Stonewall Nation, which she then records as a 45 RPM in 1972. The Advocate says that this is the first gay liberation 45 RPM. And Jim Zeiss is inspired by this song, and he helps to start a gay radio program called Stonewall Nation that was broadcast on WBFO 88.7 FM. And at the time, WBFO was owned by SUNY at Buffalo, actually broadcast from the Main Street campus. And so Jim helps to get the Stonewall Nation radio program off the ground. It starts in 1972, and his boyfriend, a guy by the name of Mike Luthi, was actually the first host of the show. And we could see this article from the Fifth Freedom, or advertisement from the Fifth Freedom, telling us that it was a weekly program every Thursday from 10:30 to 11 p.m. Recent shows have included news of gay life and liberation. And Christy's also going to put a link to the digital collection of the Davis Archive, where at SUNY Buffalo State, where you can listen to some of the issues, or excuse me, episodes of the Stonewall Nation radio program that still exist. And then I also wanted to point out that Mattachine does eventually move out of UUCB and starts their own gay services center. The first was located at the corner of Elmwood and West Utica, but that first center only it lasts for about 3 weeks before the building is destroyed in a fire. So we can see the advertisement for the grand opening, and there were 3 floors of the building. There was a bank on the first floor, then there was the Gay Services Center, then there was a ballet company that was called the Festival Ballet of New York on the 3rd floor, and then we can see this article. So just 3 weeks after the grand opening on March 27th, talking about how the ballet studio had been lost in in this fire of the building, and that $50,000 worth of costumes were destroyed. And then Mattachine goes back to UUCB, and then eventually move into another gay community services center that was located in the Franklin building at 45 Allen Street. So I just wanted to mention that in terms of the organization's relationship to UUCB. And so Jim, along with a group of other gay men from Buffalo, moves to Washington, D.C. in 1973 because he decides that he doesn't want to just be an academic, but he wants to get involved in politics. Oh, sorry about that. And also the gay liberation movement. And so this group of gay men that moved to Washington, D.C. from Buffalo and kind of take D.C. by storm, the gay community in D.C. calls them the Buffalo Gay Mafia. So sorry, Bills fans, you were not the original Buffalo Mafia. We have the Buffalo Gay Mafia. And kind of the joke that they had amongst themselves was, Jim was an activist and a politician, so he made the news. Don Michaels, former president of Mattachine in Buffalo, who also worked on the Fifth Freedom, he was a journalist for the Washington Blade, so he wrote the news. And then Richard McGinnis, who was the manager of the Lambda Rising bookstore, a gay bookstore in DC, he then sold the news, right? So one made the news, one wrote about the news, one sold the news, and they were kind of colloquially known as the Buffalo Gay Mafia. And then they did also, right, maintain relationships with other gay men that they had known and worked with in Buffalo. And this is, I think, a really cute photograph of former and current members of Mattachine from Buffalo who are reuniting in DC, and we can see Jim is kind of in the center of the photograph, and he's sticking his tongue out here. Okay. So what else does Jim Zeiss do in DC? Well, in terms of when he first moves there, He's a senior research associate for the Urban Institute, so he never can completely leaves his scholarly life behind. He was very interested in urban policy and urban studies, wrote a variety of different books and articles. He becomes the vice president and then the president of the Gay Activist Alliance in DC. He's an aide to, or he becomes an aide to the DC Mayor, Marion Barry. And in fact, his position was, he was a liaison to Ward 2. So he acted right as the go-between between Ward 2 and DC in the mayor's office. And in the early 90s, he ends up running as a Democratic candidate for the DC Council for Ward 2 as an openly gay candidate. Here's a button from his political campaign. And Ward 2 was the most diverse ward in DC. It encompassed DuPont Circle, which is the gay neighborhood, also Shaw, which was predominantly people of color. And had Jim won, you know, he would have been the first openly gay candidate elected to the DC Council. And so here's some recollections of Jim that I wanted to share that were sent to me by Deacon McCubbin, who was the founder of the Lambda Rising bookstore and also an important figure in the gay activism in DC. So he says, Jim was a very good friend to both Jim, my husband, his husband was Jim Bennett, and I. We did work together on a number of projects, including the mayoral appointments project and one of the Democratic conventions, right? So this project where they identified different gay individuals to serve on committees within the mayor's office. We had dinner together several times, and he was a regular visitor to Lambda Rising. And of course, we volunteered and contributed to his city council campaign and never forgave Jack Evans for beating him. And Jack Evans, who's one of the other candidates, wins only by around like 300 votes. He was a warm and compassionate man, had astounding intelligence, especially about political topics, and a gentle but quick wit. We had worked together in GAA and Gertrude Stein Democratic Club, and Jim was my primary contact in Mayor Barry's office. I had also been close to John Wilson, who had been Ward 2's council member, but moved up to council chair. That was when Jim decided to run for the Ward 2 position. He ran a principled and professional campaign and came so close to victory. Jim's move to Washington brought the two, I think he means the two of us together at a heady time in LGBTQ history. He arrived in 1973 and I was opening Lambda Rising in 1974. By the following year, I had put together the first annual Gay Pride Day, now celebrated as Capital Pride, and we were actively lobbying for the passage of the DC Human Rights Act, which passed in 1977. Later, when he had joined Mayor Barry's staff, Jim was our go-to person in the mayor's office. When we expanded and moved Lambda Rising to a 5,000 square foot retail space on Connecticut Avenue, Jim was one of the first people through the door on opening day. He had brought a mayoral proclamation with him, all nicely framed and announcing Lambda Rising Day in the District of Columbia. Jim was also involved in AIDS activism, and in particular, here's some more recollections from Deacon McCubbin. He was one of the Washington 64, a group of 64 gay activists who were arrested in an AIDS sit-in at the White House on June 1st of 1987. And he says, I have the original flyer that we passed around that day to instruct our group about their legal rights. While we were in jail, I had everyone sign it. Jim's signature is one of them. And if you kind of look at the right-hand side down towards the middle, his signature is upside down, but you can see it says Jim Zeiss, Washington, D.C. Oops, sorry about that. And then, as I mentioned, Jim's primary challenger in that War II race was Jack Evans, who was a heterosexual candidate, and he, loses only by around 300 votes. And I think if he would have won, he would have been that first openly gay member of the council. We would be, talking about him alongside other people like Harvey Milk or Danica Rome or Pete Buttigieg. And not long after his War II race, he takes ill with AIDS-related complications. He gets sick pretty quickly and enters into hospice care. And he passed away in 1994. And to kind of conclude here, I want to circle back around to Charlie Haynie. And Charlie dies in 2001 after battling cancer for 3 years. And it's not until 2000 that he retires from SUNY at Buffalo. And in the last years of his life, he is able to buy a home in Parkside on West Oakwood Place. But I asked his daughter, Erin, if you could associate your dad with one place in Buffalo, what would it be? And without hesitating, she said, Talking Leaves Books. And so Charlie had a pension from SUNY at Buffalo. And when he was dying from cancer, one of the things that he decided he was going to do with his pension is that he was going to buy whatever book he wanted from Talking Leaves in hardcover without waiting for it to come out in paperback. So he amassed this collection of books, and then at his memorial reception, which was held at his residence on Oakwood Place, they allowed people who came to take some of these books that he accumulated during the last years of his life. So in sum, I think both of these activists help us to think differently about gay liberation movement in Buffalo and beyond, in particular in terms of how the university community impacted what was going on in a broader sense in terms of the gay and lesbian community in Buffalo, right? And then how the community also with, for example, Mattachine impacted what was going on with the university and how things are changing in terms of place and space, especially with the expansion of SUNY at Buffalo, and trying to find spaces within the larger Western New York community to be able to do this sort of work. And again, I think both are somewhat unique figures in a sense for the approach that they took to masculinity, and realizing that in order to kind of do this revolutionary work of social change, we had to think about what it meant to be a man in society at the time differently. And it couldn't be this domineering macho kind of image. It had to be about thinking about power and men's relationships with other people in a more collective, communal way. So I hope you have lots of questions, and I will conclude there and
Thank
come
you
back.
so much. Thank you so much, Jeff. And I love that that final anecdote of asking his daughter what spot she would associate with him, and it being something completely separate from those sites with his work and his living. And I think that really fits in the general kind of the underlining theme of your lecture today. You know, as preservationists, we focus so much on the built environment and kind of boiling down what makes a building significant, that it was this architect or this person lived or died or did this thing in that building. And we kind of boil down that interest in those significant points just to get it out and to convey it quicker and easier to people. But in actuality, our relationship and the reason why our built environment is significant is much more nuanced and tangled than a quick, easy, this is what happened there, or this is who built it, or so on and so forth. So that is really kind of fitting topic today. We don't have many questions, honestly, but we have one very, very good question from our friend Daniel McKay, which is, how to utilize, how is the best way to utilize growing public interest in these topics in Buffalo and in upstate New York? Where are the archives to be mined in Western New York or elsewhere, and collections to be collated and requested? Is there a role for crowdsourced support in this work at that stage? I mean, just to jump in quickly to answer first and foremost, all of the research, the Madeline Davis archive at Buff State is the biggest resource that we have here. But yeah, you take that away.
Well, certainly there's the Davis archive, and then there's also the university archives at SUNY Buffalo, which has a lot of the Tolstoy College material. But for some of this, for a lot of this, actually, I had to go outside of Buffalo to, particularly with Jim Zeiss, right, to better understand the work that he did in Buffalo and the significance of that, right? Because if we look at the materials from his political campaign, he's very explicit about the fact that it's the work that he did in Buffalo that gave him his start, that set him up for this, and he was particularly proud about the work that he did with Madeline Davis and her speech at the DNC and the role that he played in that. Was actually mentioned in his obituary. So it's a really great question, Daniel, and I think I need to think about it more. But what's immediately coming to my mind, right, is that to understand the significance of what happened in Buffalo, and that the places that these two men were connected to. I also had to look at material that was outside of Buffalo, and I think unfortunately with Jim, some of his organizational materials for the 71 March on Albany are in the Davis archive because they were saved as part of the Mattachine Society records. But in terms of a lot of what he did in DC, there's like nothing. And I went so far as to track down the executor of his will and talk to him, and Ray basically, he said first, Jim got sick and died pretty quickly, and he also wasn't a self-aggrandizing person, and wasn't at that point thinking, I should get my stuff together to donate to an archive. And I think if he had lived longer, we would have a lot of those materials, or we would have oral histories with him. But yeah, this was a great exercise for me in terms of understanding what happened in Buffalo. Sometimes we have to go outside of Buffalo and look at other sources and other collections.
Definitely. I mean, again, also coming back to that same point that that bi-coastal idea of gay liberation, of gay rights movement, because of that, maybe there, there hasn't been, they might have had resources, or there might have been resources that talked about the middle area and their influence and participation. But in that moment, it didn't seem like something that was significant to keep. So yeah, having to come up with kind of play catch up on all of those previous decisions to not save that information is definitely a struggle moving forward.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the Buffalo Gay Mafia, which I love that. That's an example that I think works against the bicoastal notion of LGBTQ history, right? Because that narrative would say nothing significant is happening in a place like Buffalo. If you want to, get involved in gay politics or journalism or whatever, you have to do it in one of these bigger cities. But then clearly we had this group of gay men who went to DC and were able to accomplish what they did in part because of the foundation that they had in Buffalo.
Well, that's a great point. And with there's no more questions, I guess we've answered everything. Everyone is satisfied. But on that note of the bicoastalness and the influence and role that gay liberation played across all of these communities, do a little plug for our program that's coming up this Tuesday. It's actually a joint program with the New York City LGBT Historic Sites Project, where we're going to be exploring some of the gay liberation sites here in Western New York and New York City, and try to draw some more of those connections and similarities, and certainly also differences in how those movements worked, again, to kind of show a more holistic, full narrative of gay liberation in the state, that it's not just those those headline things that happened in New York City. It was things happening across the state that contributed to that movement moving forward. So you can go to our website, www.preservationbuffaloniagara.org, to register for that program. Dr. Jeff will be our head for that on that one as well. So with that, thank you so very much, certainly to Jeff for all of your information and wonderful presentation, and for everyone joining us today. And with that, have a great rest of your night and see you soon.